had accepted, for over 15 years, that my share of my grandparents' family trust simply didn't exist anymore. Spent, according to my uncle, on legal fees, property taxes, and a series of unfortunate investment losses that had, apparently, consumed the entire trust before I ever turned 25, the age at which my grandparents' original trust documents specified I would receive my designated portion. The new trustee's first formal audit, completed 14 months after my uncle finally, reluctantly stepped down from managing the trust, found $340,000 sitting, untouched, in an account he had never once mentioned across 2 decades of managing my grandparents' estate. My grandparents' original intentions. My name is Jennifer Alvarez, and the trust in question was established by my grandparents, Robert and Alina Whitfield, in 1998, 3 years before my grandfather's death, structured specifically to provide for their 4 grandchildren, myself, my 2 cousins Bradley and Kristen, and my cousin Marcus, with each of us designated to receive an equal 1/4 share of the trust's assets upon reaching 25 years old. My grandparents had built a genuinely substantial estate across their lifetimes. Primarily through a successful chain of hardware stores my grandfather had operated across central Texas, along with considerable real estate holdings accumulated over several decades. The original trust, established with the guidance of an estate attorney my grandparents had worked with for years, was funded with assets that, according to the original 1998 documentation, Patricia Alvarez, no relation to me, a family law and trust attorney I would eventually retain, later helped me obtain, totaled approximately $1.8 million at the time of the trust's establishment. My uncle, Gerald Whitfield, my mother's older brother, was designated as the trust's managing trustee following my grandfather's death in 2001, a role that gave him considerable discretionary authority over the trust's investment decisions, distributions, and overall management across what would eventually become over 2 decades of stewardship. The first distributions. My cousin Bradley, the oldest of the 4 designated beneficiaries, turned 25 in 2009 and received, according to family accounts at the time, his full designated share of the trust, a distribution that, based on what I would later learn through the eventual audit, totaled approximately $410,000, reflecting his equal quarter share of the trust's value at that specific point in its management. My cousin Kristen turned 25 in 2012, receiving what I understood at the time to be a similarly substantial distribution, though family conversations about the specific figures involved remained, characteristically, vague and imprecise across those years. By the time I turned 25 myself, in 2016, my uncle's explanations regarding the trust's remaining value had shifted considerably from the confident, substantial figures associated with Bradley and Kristen's earlier distributions. The market's been genuinely difficult these past few years, my uncle told me, during the specific conversation where I first raised the question of my own upcoming distribution. Between some investment losses, the ongoing property tax burden on the remaining real estate holdings, and legal costs from settling a boundary dispute on one of the commercial properties, I need you to understand that what's actually left for your share is considerably smaller than what Bradley and Kristen received. What I actually received. My eventual distribution, delivered later that year in 2016, totaled $38,000, a figure dramatically smaller than either of my older cousins' distributions, an outcome my uncle attributed entirely to genuine, if unfortunate, market conditions and management challenges that had, according to his explanation, significantly depleted the trust's remaining value by the specific time my own 25th birthday distribution came due. I want to be honest that I accepted this explanation, at the time, with considerably less scrutiny than in retrospect, the situation likely warranted. I was 25 years old, genuinely grateful for even a modest distribution from a trust I understood primarily as a generous, unexpected gift from grandparents who had passed away when I was young. Rather than as a carefully documented legal entitlement, I felt equipped or inclined to formally investigate. My youngest cousin, Marcus, turned 25 in 2019 and received, according to my uncle's account at the time, an even smaller distribution than my own, approximately $12,000, attributed to continued market challenges and what my uncle described as the trust's effectively near-total depletion by that point. The growing unease. I want to walk through the specific accumulation of small, individually explainable details that, across the following several years, gradually built into a genuine, if initially vague, unease about my uncle's management of the trust. Unease I hadn't yet found the specific occasion or evidence to act upon directly. My uncle's own visible lifestyle, across the years he managed the trust, seemed to me, in retrospect, considerably more comfortable than his stated income as a mid-level regional sales manager would typically support. A beach property acquired in 2015. A pattern of expensive vacations documented across his social media presence. A lifestyle that, individually, I had never thought to specifically connect to his parallel role managing our family trust. My cousin Marcus, several years after his own considerably smaller distribution, mentioned during a family gathering in 2022 that he'd recently attempted to request formal documentation of the trust's final accounting from my uncle. A request my uncle had, according to Marcus, deflected repeatedly with vague explanations about the complexity of gathering old records from a trust that had, by that point, been formally closed out following Marcus's own final distribution. This specific detail, a managing trustee resistant to providing formal accounting documentation even after the trust's stated closure, became, for me, the first genuinely concrete signal that something beyond simple, unfortunate market conditions might explain the dramatic disparity between Bradley and Kristen's substantial early distributions and Marcus's, and my own considerably smaller later ones. Retaining an attorney. I contacted Patricia Alvarez, a trust and estate attorney with specific experience in cases involving suspected trustee mismanagement, in early 2023, roughly 7 years after my own distribution, and explaining the accumulated pattern of unease I developed regarding my uncle's management of our grandparents' trust. What you're describing, Patricia told me during our initial consultation, isn't necessarily evidence of wrongdoing on its own. Trust values genuinely can decline significantly due to poor investment decisions, market conditions, and legitimate expenses. But the specific pattern you're describing, a trustee resistant to providing formal accounting, combined with a lifestyle that seems inconsistent with his stated income, combined with dramatically declining distributions across a relatively short period, is exactly the kind of pattern that warrants a formal request for accounting, which, as a trust beneficiary, you have a clear legal right to request regardless of your uncle's willingness to cooperate voluntarily. Patricia helped me file a formal legal request for complete trust accounting, a request that, under Texas trust law, my uncle was legally obligated to fulfill within a specified timeframe, regardless of his personal willingness to provide the information voluntarily. My uncle's resistance. My uncle's response to this formal legal request, once he received it through Patricia's office, was immediate and visibly defensive. A phone call to me directly, bypassing the formal legal channel entirely, expressing considerable anger at what he characterized as an unnecessary, insulting escalation of a situation he insisted had always been handled honestly and transparently. "I don't understand why you're doing this," he told me during that call. "I managed that trust for over 2 decades, through genuinely difficult market conditions, and I gave all 4 of you exactly what was actually available at each of your respective distribution dates. This feels like you're accusing me of stealing from my own family, Jennifer, and frankly, that's deeply hurtful after everything I did to manage that trust responsibly for all those years." I want to be honest that this response, delivered with what struck me as genuine emotional conviction, gave me real pause about whether I was, in fact, pursuing an unfair, unfounded accusation against a family member who had genuinely done his honest best with a challenging financial management responsibility. But Patricia's guidance, at this specific juncture, remained clear and steady. His emotional response to a formal accounting request, she told me, isn't itself evidence of either guilt or innocence. What matters is whether he actually provides complete, accurate documentation within the legally required timeframe. If everything has genuinely been handled honestly, a complete accounting should simply confirm that, and this entire process should resolve itself without further complication. The accounting and what it revealed. My uncle, facing the formal legal obligation Patricia's request had established, eventually provided a partial accounting, documentation that, upon Patricia's careful review, contained significant, troubling gaps, including several years of investment account statements that were either missing entirely or provided in a format that made verifying actual transaction history genuinely difficult. This accounting is not complete, Patricia told me after her initial review. There are specific gaps here that go beyond simple record-keeping carelessness. I'd recommend we petition the court to compel a more thorough, independent forensic accounting of the trust's full history, rather than relying on the partial documentation your uncle has voluntarily provided. This petition, filed through Texas probate court, given the trust's original establishment and jurisdiction, ultimately resulted in a court order compelling my uncle's removal as trustee, with a licensed, independent professional fiduciary appointed as successor trustee, specifically tasked with completing a comprehensive forensic audit of the trust's full 20-plus year history. What the forensic audit found. The new trustee, a licensed fiduciary named Robert Castellano, who specialized in exactly this kind of complex, multi-decade trust reconstruction, completed his comprehensive audit approximately 14 months after formally assuming trustee responsibilities. A process that involved reconstructing over 2 decades of investment account records, property transaction histories, and distribution documentation. The audit's findings, delivered to all 4 beneficiaries in a formal written report, revealed a pattern considerably more troubling than simple, honest investment losses. While the trust had genuinely experienced some legitimate investment losses and expenses across its history, consistent with normal market fluctuations any long-term trust might reasonably experience, the audit also identified a specific pattern of my uncle transferring trust assets into a separate account, one never disclosed in any of his periodic reports to beneficiaries, that had accumulated. Through a combination of transferred trust assets and their own subsequent investment growth, to a final balance of $340,000 by the time of the audit's completion. This account, structured, according to Castellano's forensic analysis, in a way that obscured its direct connection to the original family trust, appeared to have been established specifically around the same period as my own and Marcus's significantly reduced distributions, suggesting a pattern where my uncle had, apparently, diverted assets that should have gone toward our respective shares into a separate holding he retained personal, undisclosed control over. Confronting my uncle with the findings. I confronted my uncle directly once Castellano's formal audit report was complete, in a meeting also attended by Patricia, and notably my cousin Marcus, whose own significantly reduced distribution had been similarly affected by whatever pattern the audit had uncovered. My uncle's response to this formal, documented evidence shifted considerably from his earlier, confident denial. "I always intended to eventually distribute that remaining balance," he said, though the explanation carried a defensiveness that suggested even he recognized its inadequacy against the weight of the actual documented evidence. I set that account aside during a period when I was genuinely worried about additional legal costs from the property boundary dispute, and I suppose, over time, I simply never got around to formally reconciling it back into the trust's distribution accounting. "Uncle Gerald," I said, "that explanation doesn't account for why you told Marcus and me, directly and repeatedly, that the trust's remaining value had been almost entirely depleted, while simultaneously maintaining a separate account holding over $300,000 that neither of us ever knew existed. That's not an oversight. That's a deliberate pattern of misrepresentation sustained across multiple years." The resolution. The formal legal resolution that followed, negotiated through Patricia and the other beneficiaries' respective attorneys, resulted in the full $340,000, plus additional accrued interest calculated from the point the funds should have originally been distributed, being divided between Marcus and me, reflecting the specific, documented shortfall in our original distributions relative to what Bradley and Kristen had received years earlier. My uncle, facing both this civil resolution and a formal referral to local law enforcement regarding potential breach of fiduciary duty and fraud, ultimately avoided criminal prosecution through a negotiated settlement that included full financial restitution, alongside a formal, permanent removal from any future fiduciary role regarding family assets. A resolution that Patricia characterized as a reasonably favorable outcome for Marcus and me. Given the genuine complexity and expense that a full criminal prosecution would likely have required to pursue to conclusion. Epilogue. It has been just over a year since Castellano's forensic audit revealed the full $340,000 my uncle had managed to keep hidden across nearly a decade of misrepresenting our family trust's actual remaining value. And my family, understandably, remains genuinely fractured by the full weight of what this process ultimately revealed. My relationship with my uncle has not survived this reckoning in any meaningful form. A genuine, if painful, outcome I've made peace with, understanding that some breaches of trust, particularly ones sustained deliberately across nearly a decade of direct, personal misrepresentation to family members who trusted him, don't necessarily deserve or require reconciliation, simply because the person responsible happens to be family. My relationship with Marcus, by contrast, has grown considerably closer through this shared experience of finally understanding and correcting a shared injustice neither of us had the full context to recognize clearly on our own. We speak regularly now, in a way we rarely had before this entire process began, bonded by the specific, difficult work of pursuing accountability together rather than each quietly, separately accepting an explanation that neither of us had ever felt fully comfortable with. I think often about the specific years I spent simply accepting my uncle's explanation for my own dramatically reduced distribution, never quite finding the specific occasion or confidence to formally question a family member's account of a financial situation I had no independent way, at the time, to verify myself. I think about how easily that acceptance might have remained permanent, had Marcus's own persistent, if initially unsuccessful, requests for documentation not eventually planted the specific seed of doubt that led me to finally seek my own formal answers. Trust, within families, I've come to understand more clearly through this entire experience, sometimes requires more scrutiny rather than less, precisely because the personal relationship involved can make genuine accountability feel, in the moment, more uncomfortable to pursue than it would with any other financial relationship in our lives. I'm genuinely grateful, in the end, that Marcus's persistence and my own eventual willingness to formally investigate led us both, finally, to the accurate accounting our grandparents' original trust had always actually entitled us to receive. The end.